Alright, so moving on to our next big argument that the Founding Fathers faced as they wrote the Constitution. Now remember, we have all these representatives, 55 representatives, they're called the Founding Fathers, and they're meeting together in Philadelphia, and they call the meeting the Philadelphia Convention. Remember, we just talked about the Great Compromise. Well, now we have another argument, the next argument to deal with. Now remember, in the last video, the Great Compromise split Congress into two different groups. You have the Senate and the House of Representatives. And remember that the number of representatives you get in the House of Representatives is based on your state's population, how many people that are living in the state. Now, because of this, the South has a very interesting question. The question is, do we count our slaves as part of population or not? Now, remember when the South is asking this question, that slaves are not considered citizens, and so therefore they're not really a part of a state's population. So the northern states who had very little slaves, if they had any at all, said, you can't do that. You can't count slaves as part of your population because slaves are property. They're not citizens. So they should not count as part of your population. But of course, the South, they said, yes, we can count the slaves because it'll really help us get more representatives in Congress, which would mean they would have more power. So of course the Founding Fathers argue and argue and argue about whether to count slaves as part of population or not, until finally they come up with a compromise. Now the compromise is called the 3/5 Compromise. So let's say you have 5 white citizens. Out of these 5 white citizens, a total of 5 of them would be counted as population. So let's say you have 5 slaves. Out of these 5 slaves, only 3 of them would be counted as population, because out of the 5, you only count 3. So that means the total population of your state would be 8, because you count your 5 white citizens, and you only count 3 out of the 5 slaves. So that means you have a total population of 8. So let's take a look at what would happen if the South could count all of their slaves. So here's the math. Here's what it looks like if the South could count all of their slaves. Here's an example. In the North, let's say you have 10 white citizens. Okay, so your 10 white citizens plus your slaves in your northern state. There's probably no slaves in your northern state, so you have a total population of 10. Well, in the South, let's say you have 7 citizens. But you add in your slaves, let's say you have 5 slaves, and since we're counting all of your slaves, you now have a total population of 12. So now the southern state, has more population, which means the South is going to get more representatives. So let's see what the numbers would be like and who would get more representatives if the northern states got their way and no slaves were counted. So this is if no slaves were counted. So in the North, again, our northern state has 10 citizens, but they don't have any slaves. So the total population is 10. In the South, again, the citizens, there's 7 citizens in the southern state, but you do not count the slaves. So the total population in the southern state is only 7. This means that the North gets more representatives. So whichever way you look at it, if the southern states got their way, then it would be unfair to the northern states. But if the northern states got their way, then it would be unfair to the. So let's see what would happen if we apply the 3/5 Compromise into this. Okay, so the citizens in the northern states, they have 10 still. They have 0 slaves, so the total population is 10. In the South, they have 7 citizens in your southern state. They have 5 slaves, but only 3 of those slaves are counted, so the total population is 10. So it's fair, it's equal. The southern states got to count 3 out of their 5 slaves. The total population is equal. Everybody wins. So the 3/5 Compromise works. The 3/5 Compromise ends up being fair for both sides. Both sides call it a win, and they agree to it. That's the end of this argument.